I would like to start by thanking everyone for their patience. Thank you very much. My name is Alfaf, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session of the Research Methods Special Interest Group at the International Association for Psychology of Language Learning. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, a distinguished academic whose work has had a profound impact on multiple fields, including applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, psychology, and education. Professor Jean-Marc DEWAELE research stands at the fascinating intersection of language, emotion, and individual differences. His interdisciplinary approach has eliminated key areas such as multilingual communication, the emotional challenges faced by language learners in intercultural contexts, and the role of emotions in language learning and teaching. Today, we're fortunate to hear Jean-Marc speak on the mixed methods allow researchers to develop binocular vision. In this presentation, Professor Jean-Marc will argue for the value of combining quantitative and qualitative research methods to reveal both generalizable patterns and unique participants' insights. His ideas promise to deepen our understanding of how mixed methods can enrich research into the emotional and cognitive dimensions of language learning. With over 300 publications and a career spanning nearly 3 decades at Birkbeck, University of London, he has been a leading voice in the field and a mentor to many scholars, including myself, as my time as his PhD student. Let's warmly welcome Professor Jean-Marc DEWAELE to our virtual session. If you have any question, you will have the opportunity to ask at the end of the presentation. Jean-Marc DEWAELE, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alpha.
Yes.
Good. Well, I will ask you then to click on the next button, Alpha.
Yeah, of course.
So my PowerPoint is inspired by Creswell, who is the authority in the field of mixed methods. I also combined it with slides from a PowerPoint by Peter McIntyre on mixed methods. And as Alpha knows, I'm a big proponent of mixed methods. I think it's really excellent to combine the strength of quantitative and qualitative research. So quantitative research allows researchers to try and understand universal effects, breaking down events in manageable segments, and to avoid idiosyncratic data or replications. Sometimes you can get data that are weird for some reason. And hence, if you have a large enough sample of quantitative data, it allows you to see what average and means are in a certain population, to see who the outliers are. So you don't base your research on some outliers that you happen to have in your classroom, for example. Also, with controlled conditions, interpretation becomes easier. It's also developing predications and causal explanations on possible relationships between variables. And it gives us also established norms for a given test or for questionnaire, so we can see whether people are about average or whether they stand out towards the top or the bottom of some dimension. Next slide. So 3 examples of quantitative methods. We have experiments, quasi-experiments, or survey research. So experiments, of course, are beautiful, but time intensive. You have to set up experimental conditions to manipulate an independent variable to observe its effect on a dependent variable. So experiments typically occur in labs. You need to control what is happening to make sure that exactly the same things are happening to different participants, and that might not happen in an intact classroom, for example. You might have individual learners participating in the experiment. Then quasi-experiments include naturally occurring events or groupings. So that could be an intact classroom where you decide to apply a specific method and see whether that has an effect. And then survey research, which I have done a lot. So you use questionnaires or online questionnaires to try and collect data on variables that you're interested in, using closed questions or with Likert scales, or possibly also some you could add some open questions. So at that point, you in fact already create a mixed methods design. Next slide. So the strength of qualitative research is that it focuses really on understanding meaning, especially in the eyes of the participants, what is meaningful to them rather than what is meaningful to you as a researcher. Qualitative research allows you to understand the context. Of course, you cannot do qualitative research with numbers similar to quantitative research. So with the study I did with Peter McIntyre in 2014, we had over 1,700 participants. So it would be impossible to do decent qualitative research on such a huge sample. So you can do in-depth research on no more than a handful or maybe 10 or 15 participants to collect rich data on their views and to hear their voices. Qualitative research is also good to understand the thinking process of participants, and it can help researchers in trying to understand causal links between what they observe and what participants say about what they do or don't do. Next slide. So examples, again, of qualitative methods, interviews where respondents are asked for their views on what the researcher is interested in. It could be extensive, it can be detailed. You can have focus groups, and a number of my PhD students recently have used that method. So you have a number of, say, learners from a particular group, you have them sit together, you ask them questions in group, and the fact that they are in group, they may make observations about things that they agree and disagree on, and it's also a method that Alpha used for her PhD. So you can get more interesting things than in pure interviews where the researcher interviews the participants, because they may bring up things that you hadn't thought of. And that's exactly, in fact, the whole aim of qualitative research, that things come up that as a researcher you had not imagined. Of course, another method is participant observation, again, something that Alpha did, where the researcher participates in a group while studying it or documenting it. It could also be simply observing, classroom observations. So the researcher could sit in the back and then observe why somebody is participating or not much participating in the language class. And then afterwards, there could be an interview with these participants asking them, yeah, why were you quite silent today? Usually you're always participating, what happened? And then you find out the reason why that person in that moment, in that context, was not doing much. Case studies are always interesting, where you focus on one individual or a handful of individuals collecting as much rich data as possible. Case studies is perfect combined with longitudinal design. So you follow one person over a certain period. It could be a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and you ask them about their progress, how they feel, what they are doing, etc. Another type of research then is action research, where you develop and study an intervention as it is being implemented. So it could be a new teaching method that you implement. So that would be a really interesting kind of qualitative research. Next slide. So maybe you need to click once more. This is a framework for mixed methods where you combine quantitative and qualitative data, where the quantitative data requires its own method, as does the qualitative data. You combine different perspectives, more specifically the emic perspective, which is the participant's view, and the etic perspective, which is typically more quantitative and which is the researcher's point of view. So combining these two perspectives is what I call binocular vision, meaning that you are using your left eye and your right eye, and it allows you to have in-depth view of what it is that you are observing. Next slide. Mixed methods, you collect both types of data, you mix them. You can either mix them at one point in time, so concurrently, or one after the other, meaning you could collect first quantitative and then qualitative data, or vice versa, or you could start with some qualitative, then quantitative, and then again more qualitative. And you can emphasize either method equally or unequally. So you could say that you choose a mixed methods design with a focus on quantitative, where the qualitative is just a little addition, or you could do it the other way around. Next slide. The definition by Creswell, it's mixed method research is a method and methodology. So it involves collecting, analyzing, integrating both quant and qual research in a single study. It could be cross-sectional or longitudinal. And the whole point is to try and gain a better understanding of the research problem or the issue that either quantitative or qualitative research couldn't necessarily get to. Next slide. So with quantitative data, we use instruments or checklists or records. Qualitative data include, as I said before, interviews, observations, could also be documents or audiovisual materials. So, it's also important to realize that in doing mixed methods research, you have to think about ontology, epistemology, and methodology. So ontology, if you take a quantitative perspective, you begin with theories that you derive and you test hypotheses. So you use numerical data. In experiments, you would try and manipulate the relevant independent variables, and you use statistics to analyze the data. It requires maybe not fully random sampling, but I would say non-random. Well, we typically use a snowball sampling, or meaning that you can't just focus on the best students in your classroom if you are a teacher and you want to investigate something. So you need to make sure that you have a relatively representative sample of your target population. So it allows you to make causal statements in the sense that this independent variable seems to predict X% of variance in the dependent variable that you're interested in. It's typically correlational, so you try to find general tendencies. You can run patterns and components analysis. You can analyze covariance. In contrast, qualitative research is more descriptive. It ends with hypothesis and grounded theory, so you don't necessarily start with a hypothesis that you test. It's all about emergence and portrayal. The researcher is an instrument. It's naturalistic, inductive. You search for patterns. You seek pluralism and complexity. And sometimes, if you're a PhD student, that can cause problems with supervisors or second supervisors who may not be familiar with that approach. So if your supervisor is a strict quantitative person and say with modernist perspectives, then he or she might be uncomfortable if you tell them that you want to collect qualitative data, but that you don't have a hypothesis to test. And they say, oh, what? You don't want to test a hypothesis? And you say, no, I want to collect the data, see what comes out of the data. What is it that students will say? And then they might be uncomfortable. I mean, what? You don't know what the students will say? Well, no, I haven't collected the data yet. And sometimes applying for grants using an inductive method is more difficult because reviewers often want you to have a very clear idea about what it is that you're going to do, what kind of data will you collect, and what is it you will find. So sometimes it's easier to apply for a grant after you have actually collected all the data and run the analysis and you know what it is that you will find. Next slide. So, so there are different worldviews here. For epistemologically, the quantitative researcher will tell you that facts are objective, right? And that hence a method repeated will produce the same results almost every time. That it's possible to identify variables and relationships with known precision, and that it's okay to take the observers, outsiders' point of view. Now, if you do qualitative research, then you realize that reality is socially constructed, that methods cannot be repeated because individuals are different, every individual is different, that variables are complex, that reality is messy, and you take an insider's point of view. So the differences, of course, in quantitative research, the purpose is prediction, generalization, and some causal or near causal explanations, where the researcher is detached and impartial and feels objectively portrayed. In qualitative research, on the other hand, generalization is not the point. So you can highlight things that emerge from the data, but it's always fuzzy. Interpretation is consensual, so you need to convince the reader and the reviewers that your interpretation is valid. And it's absolutely vital that you understand the perspectives of your participants. And so as a researcher, you are personally involved and partial, so you have to reflect on your own position in the process. You are empathetic and understanding, which doesn't mean that you are necessarily sympathetic, but that's a more ethical issue that we could discuss later. So we can mix or link the data. So the converge data with qualitative and quantitative together. We can also connect them, the qualitative with the quantitative, leading to results. And we can also embed qualitative data within a quantitative data set. So typical situations for mixed method research, so comparing results from quantitative, qualitative research. And what I love best, and I think Alpha did that really nicely, and other former PhD students of mine, is to use the qualitative research to help explain quantitative findings, because quantitative findings are not always interesting in themselves. You could say, you know, there was a relationship between this and that variable. Now, that is relatively interesting, but it becomes much more interesting if you can explain why, or why participants felt that this and that was linked. And so we can use qualitative research to try and find a generalization for quantitative patterns that were observed in the data. Also, we can develop instruments. We can enrich an experiment with qualitative data. And I would say that papers that are mixed methods, if you have qualitative data, it makes it more appealing to the reader who is interested in hearing or reading a good quote from a participant. A good quote from a participant can even serve as a title for a future paper, because sometimes participants say wonderful things, and you would never have the voices of participants like that in a purely quantitative framework. So why use mixed methods? One is the argument of that one or the other would be insufficient. I don't necessarily always agree with that. I think it depends. That you can do perfectly fine in a purely qualitative or purely quantitative way, and I've done so, and in fact more quantitative than qualitative studies. The multiple angles argument, so that you want different pictures. Also, the more evidence, the better. So having both quant and qual data is just more evidence. The community of practice argument, where you point out that mixed methods are a preferred approach within a scholarly community. So if you want to publish a paper in a journal that typically has that uses that kind of framework, then you have to follow that. And it's interesting that some journals still stick to a purely quantitative perspective, and they might not like your qualitative perspective, and they might ask you to drop that part of the study. So sometimes you have to fight with reviewers and editors in defending your method, because I feel that as a researcher, you have every freedom to decide whether or not to use mixed methods. The eager to learn argument, in the sense that mixed methods is a good, cool methodology, and also its intuitive argument, namely that the mixed methods allows you to observe real life. If you start thinking about designing a mixed methods research design, of course, it depends on the problem that you are interested in, on the content, the topic. So you have to argue why you feel that mixed methods might help you address your research questions. You need to have access, of course, to qualitative and quantitative data. You need to have the background and resources, and your audience needs to be receptive. So first, the general question. So you can write it as a question, see how it is phrased, make sure that it is specific enough and focused enough. So is it an answer that you can answer? And I would say that is the rule for any reviewer and PhD examiner. It is whether there is a good match between the research question and the research design. So they will check whether your research design allows you to answer the research question. And it doesn't matter what the question is, but they need to see that, yes, with that design and those methods, you can answer those research questions. So you need to make sure that you have research questions that address both the quantitative and the qualitative element in your study. Next slide. So we can have different designs where you have concurrent mixed methods design. It's the so-called triangulation design. So you collect both quantitative and qualitative data simultaneously, and you use both together to interpret. You can also have this embedded design where you may run a pre-test that gives you some data and some preliminary results. You can then go through an intervention and observe qualitatively what happens in the classroom, for example, and then you can switch to quantitative again with the post-test, analyzing data and results, and that would lead to an interpretation at the end. So that's a slightly different mixed methods design. Then the sequential design, of course, it can be explanatory, where you collect quantitative data, you do a follow-up, then you have qualitative data with your results, leads to interpretation, or you use the qualitative data to build your quantitative data collection and results, and then that leads to the interpretation. Or you can have this sequential embedded design where you will have qualitative data before the intervention, then you have the intervention with quantitative data, and then again qualitative data collected after the intervention, and that allows you to interpret the data. Next one. So I won't read this all out to you, but Alpha, feel free to share this PowerPoint. So there are different ways to combine quantitative and qualitative. They can have equal weight, or you can focus more on one or the other. And all that is your choice. I mean, you have to explain why you make a choice, but you are perfectly allowed to make any choice you want, as long as you can explain why. And as Alpha remembers, because she passed her Viva not that long ago, as long as you can argue why, it's fine. Next one. So this is an example of concurrent triangulation with quantitative and qualitative data collection. So you do your statistical analysis, you collect your qualitative data, you do coding or some thematic analysis. You can use grounded theory, for example. You may even do some quantification of your qualitative data in trying to find out what the most frequent themes are, and who it was that mentioned certain themes, and then you combine the results of both types of analysis, and you come to some composite model. So if you do explanatory sequential, then again, you start with quantitative, you do run the analysis, and then you can select a few cases. And I would typically encourage my students to focus on cases of students who were very divergent for some way. You could pick a few average students in the dimensions that you're interested in, and then pick ones that were either very high or very low on that dimension, because then you can collect data and try to find out why it is that they occupy that particular position on the dimension. And then you can analyze the data that you get from this small number of cases, and you can do an interpretation based on both your quantitative and your qualitative results. Next one. So here again, exploratory sequential design for longitudinal design over 2 years, where you start with qualitative data collection, analysis, you run the analysis and you come to findings. And then in the second year, you use the qualitative data to develop an instrument, and then you collect more data. You have your quantitative analysis and results, and then so one led to the other. And that's an excellent way of doing your research. So the mixing of quant and qual, it could be, you could connect or merge or embed. You could use sequential or concurrent or a combination of both designs. And so again, the crucial thing is that because we have this technical vocabulary in describing different types of mixed methods designs, you can no longer submit a paper to a journal saying that you adopted a mixed method design, because that's too vague. You need to be much more specific in, okay, what type of design exactly? And then you need to use the technical terms that Creswell and colleagues have proposed, because those are the terms that you are supposed to know as a researcher. Next one. So qualitative research questions, typically the what, the who, the how. You focus on a single phenomenon. You use verbs like discover, understand, explore. You use non-directional language, and it needs to be a relatively general question where students or participants' perspective can emerge and be presented. If you have a quantitative research question, then it can be a hypothesis or a question. So you need to specify which are your dependent variables, your independent variables. Are there any mediating variables? Are there covariates that you will control? You develop it from theory, from previous research. You use distinct measures for both independent-dependent measures, and you order variables from independent to dependent. So say in my line of research, the independent variable could be the teaching method, and the dependent variable could be learner emotions in the classroom, be it enjoyment or anxiety or boredom. Next slide. And so it's good to write qualitative research questions and quantitative research questions if you use this mixed methods design. So they need to be separated. So you can ask, will the teaching method, will this new method have a positive effect on learners' emotions? That's a quantitative research question. And how do students experience this new research methods in the classroom? That's a qualitative research question. Then it means that the data that you will collect will allow you to answer both questions, and you will be able to connect them, and that will make a solid argument. Next one. So there are there are more ways, but there are 3 ways to write this question. So you can ask, to what extent do the qualitative results confirm the quantitative results? So that's really a focus on mixed methods research. It could be content focused. So how do the interviews with your students support the quantitative results that positive emotions increase over time while negative emotions decrease? Okay. Or you could have a hybrid of both. What results emerge from comparing the exploratory qualitative data about positive, negative emotions with quantitative data measured with a validated instrument. So there, these are 3 ways to write research questions. And sometimes students of mine have rewritten their research questions as they became aware that the initial formulation of the research question did not quite allow them to do what they had discovered in their data was interesting, or things that they had decided to drop because there was no mention of it in the data. So you are allowed to slightly adjust your research questions depending on the kind of things that you find. Next one. So what are the benefits? Well, as I said, binocular vision. I think you can tell a more complete story. Approaches have complementary strength. They compensate for the weaknesses of the other. Eclectic methods foster cooperation across disciplines. It takes advantage of multiple worldviews. And I like that. I think that as applied linguists, we need to be open to methods and concepts from neighboring disciplines. And if they can help us answer research questions that matter to us within the field of applied linguistics, then we have every right to try and use these different methods. And of course, it's always crucial to remember that every individual is unique, and hence that their views on what is happening to them and why they are reacting in some ways is really important, as well as identifying more general population trends, so things that might apply everywhere in the world. So here is an example of a mixed methods that McIntyre and Legato mentioned first in 2011, the ideodynamic method, where they took an in-depth dynamic look at willingness to communicate with 6 participants. So it was in fact a multiple case study, really. They collected quantitative self and observer ratings of willingness to communicate every minute on the videotape. So they had participants communicate, they filmed them, and then they asked them to watch the recording and to rate how willing they were to communicate at every other minute of this 2 or 3 minute recording. And then they asked them afterwards why it was that their willingness to communicate values dropped at certain point during the interaction. So that's a qualitative aspect to it. And then they analyzed both the graphs with the fluctuations in willingness to communicate, as well as what the students said about why their willingness to communicate or their anxiety had gone up or down. And then that allowed them to understand why these fluctuations happened. And it would have been impossible to understand that without this combination of both quantitative and qualitative data. Next one. Of course, the question is whether mixed methods, there are always opponents to mixed methods, and Simons and Gorard pointed out that qualitative, quantitative are deceptive labels because they're both inherently subjective, but not necessarily at the same points in the process. So, okay, we take that into account. That neither treats data as able to provide a definitive answer to a research question. I agree with that too. That quantitative data speak in a sense, but they do require interpretation just as qualitative data. So we shouldn't think that numbers speak for themselves. They don't. They are used by you to construct an argument, and your reviewers or your examiners might disagree with how you interpret the data. And of course, I would say you do the research and you can deal with the criticism. So it shouldn't silence you. Next one. Yeah, here are some references. So I'd be very happy now to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marc, for this interesting talk. Does anybody have any question? Bianca?
Hello, Jean-Marc. Well, thank you very much for being here with us. This is so special to us, well, to me at least it is. So it's a privilege to have you, explain everything you have explained. Actually, I had like 4 or 5 questions, and you have answered all my questions. But with your, presentation, I would still ask you one of them. It's a very simple one. I was reading your chapter, and the one that you mentioned also in the flyer, right? That we created. So the question is how, I mean, in terms of qualitative research, because as you've said, there are some editors, right, like important journals editors who are a bit reluctant to receive mixed methods, mixed, research, and especially qualitative. So when you focus only on qualitative, but let's talk about mixed methods, right? Because this is the topic. How can we researchers ensure, according to you, the voice of our participants is actually heard? So how can we kind of persuade the reader that we are being as objective as possible when we do qualitative analysis?
Yeah, it is a difficult one because, of course, we can never claim to be entirely objective, because we inevitably have to make a choice in extracts of qualitative data that we want to present. So and the reviewers don't see the other material that we did not choose to include in our analysis or in our paper. So you have to, well, you typically have to explain why you chose certain extracts. And Peter and I decided that the extracts that were that we felt were most interesting, and allowed us to speculate on possible causes for the things that we were interested in. But that could be contested, because inevitably, if you talk about something that might be slightly controversial, you could just select the negative comments about a certain teaching method and then say, I ran this qualitative analysis and look, the students, they all complained that this was wrong and that was wrong. And you don't include any positive comments. So in fact, there you are committing a cardinal sin. You are not an impartial observer. So I think that you have to be, you have to act as an honest, integer researcher, where you don't privilege one view over another, where you want to make sure that a diversity of voices and opinions in your qualitative data, that they are heard. So you don't need to give all 20 examples of each, but you need to provide at least some, maybe some quantification of the themes. And some of the themes could be positive themes about the research methods, others could be negative, and then you could specify, okay, how did you code them, how many were they? And then you can say, okay, well, in fact, the majority thought that this was good, a minority didn't approve, and these were the things that they said most. So as long as you provide the full picture, you are honest, I think the readers and reviewers will agree with you. And if they I mean, to avoid the criticism against mixed methods, you may want to include something about the benefits of mixed methods in your paper. Explain that these are the research questions that you wanted to answer, and that only through a combination of methods you could actually shed light on this phenomenon that you are interested in. And I don't think that anyone would disagree. That said, it's the reviewer, the editor's right, if you want, to exclude a certain type of research that he or she doesn't like. I'm editor of the Journal of Multilingual Multicultural Development. I would never exclude a paper on the basis of the method used, as long as um, it seems to be coherent and it brings a good story. So one problem I do have are papers based on case studies with 1 or 2 participants on some very well-known variable. Like if you say, okay, I will do a case study of 2 English foreign language learners and to understand their emotions or their motivation, then I think, well, hasn't that been done before? You know, what original finding will you have that emerges from these 2 learners? And I won't reject it straight away, but I will have a look. And if it turns out that, you know, there was a thematic analysis and everything that they said was what we already know, I would reject the paper. Not because of the method, but because the research questions maybe weren't really interesting enough and the data weren't really interesting enough, and nothing would jump out of that paper that would make that paper citable. Because in the end, that's what editors look for. They want papers that will be cited. And a paper won't be cited if everything in it is totally predictable. So it needs to have something unique. So what is the unique contribution of this paper that people will read and think, oh, that's the paper where they found this. And that's really the thing that you need to work for as an author and as a researcher.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marc, for your answer. Does anybody have other questions?
I see this question in the chat from
Yes.
Dewey on, yeah, so mixed methods design. You know, I wouldn't be too hesitant to label your work as a mixed methods study, even if you have limited quantitative data. The fact that you have quantitative data and that you run some basic stats on it makes it mixed methods. So you can say, well, you know, this is a mixed methods study with a heavy emphasis on the qualitative end, but also with a small quantitative part. And that's fine. Explain to us why you think that quantitative part was important. What does it add to your qualitative analysis? And that's fine. Just write the right kind of research question.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Jean-Marc.
Yes.
How do you think that mixed methods make research, like especially on foreign language learning, emotions, more useful for pedagogical implication and maybe practices?
Yeah, I think that researchers and teachers are happy to hear about, you know, ways to boost learners' motivation in the classroom, boost their levels of enjoyment and excitement, and say peace of mind, and to limit their levels of anxiety and boredom. So they will pay attention if you have a paper where you present, say, a new teaching method that has all these desired effects on the students. And then you need intervention studies, really see whether this method actually works, and compare it, have a control group that had so you have an experimental group and you have a control group. All that is really crucial to move forward. And I think you need to run the research first, and then you can write separate papers on the pedagogical implications of this, and you can, you know, maybe write a new course book for foreign language teaching, where you would guarantee the stronger motivation and, more positive emotions of learners. And I think that the research is also useful in pointing out the things that can go wrong, and the things Alpha knows. I had another PhD student also, Iman Kamal Ahmed, who did a longitudinal research on learner emotions in her EFL classrooms in a program for remedial English in Kurdistan. And what she discovered was that, in fact, levels of boredom went up. And she hadn't expected that. She thought that students would enjoy the course more. And then she absolutely could not understand the statistical trend that there was significantly more boredom towards the end of the semester. And so she talked to students, and it turned out that the boredom was in fact caused by one teacher in the program who was a really bad teacher, and he was very boring. And the boredom that it generated kind of contaminated everybody in the program. And so it would have been impossible to pinpoint the cause of that increasing boredom had she not spoken to students. So, I mean, can you draw a pedagogical implication from that? Well, it's that if you have one rotten apple in the batch, then the whole batch might go bad. It's not much of a pedagogical implication, but it just means yeah, that having good teachers is really crucial, and that if you have the occasional weak ones, it can do harm at group level, not just at individual level.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I had also the same factor. Teachers were like an important factor when it comes to learners' emotions in the classroom. Thank you very much, Jean-Marc, for your answer. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, Alfaf?
Elmak, yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Jean-Marc, and we are so excited for having you today. My question is related to the one of the hot issues today in research, which is the impact of technology on research. My question is, how do you see the future of mixed methods approach evolving in applied linguistics? Especially with the advancements in technology and also the analysis tools. Will this reduce the human touch in interpreting and analyzing the findings? And
thank you. That's a good question. I think that technological innovations will allow researchers to collect more physiological data, probably from learners. And I'm currently collaborating with a number of French colleagues where they used heart rate variability measures, facial recognition software, together with the usual questionnaires and classroom observations. And so the more sources of data you have, the more it allows you to try to triangulate. And you might see that something happens at a certain moment in the classroom, and then you can, if you notice that the heart rate suddenly went up, and that they looked that their facial expression changed at a certain point, and that afterwards they gave lower scores on boredom and anxiety, and they reported high levels of anxiety. Okay, then you can ask yourself, okay, what happened at that point in time? Was it something the teacher said? Was it something that they were, some task that they were involved in that they particularly enjoyed? So this technology can allow us to pinpoint things that might have pedagogical consequences. So I think we should embrace technology, but again, we should not get lost in one of the dangers, I would say, lurking when you do research is having too much data and not knowing what to do with it. And I see Alpha smiling because it's one of the topics that we discussed, that if you collect a huge and Everest of data, you might just give up. So it is very often better to not to collect too much data, to make sure that your research question is very, very, very focused, and that you get a lot of data on something very specific, so that you don't get that you don't drown in the data, because I think you need a certain degree of confidence to be able to decide that you have enough data to answer a question. And yeah, that's really important.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marc, for this incredible talk and for all information and the details about research for the mixed methods. I think we're running out of time, so we have to end this presentation now. Thank you again for the attendees. And thank you, Jean-Marc, for your amazing presentation.
Thank you very much, and sorry